Modern technology is allowing us to better understand and leverage biology like we never dreamed possible. But it's also helping us to understand just how biodiverse and valuable healthy soil can be.
We're losing soil at such a rapid rate, which means we're losing biodiversity at such a rapid rate in a system that is one of the most diverse in our entire planet. So think of all of the solutions we are losing to some of these crises.
Dr. Michelle Lynn D'Souza is a molecular ecologist who works with McCain Foods' Farm of the Future. She's passionate about regenerative agriculture and finding realistic ways to transition to regenerative practices.
I think it's McCain's responsibility in a lot of ways because it cannot be something a farmer does on their own. This is a systemic change that we're asking for. And so that needs to take everybody involved.
Michelle brings her perspective to the show of a scientist who's focused on soil microbiology and what that means for the planet and for farm businesses.
I want to help growers understand what treasure they are keeping in their farms and how to better use that to support their business.
Dr. Michelle Lynn D'Souza talks soil biology and regenerative agriculture on today's Future of Agriculture podcast. Hello, fellow Ag Nerd. Thank you so much for joining me for another episode of the Future of Agriculture. My name is Tim Hamrich, and every week you and I get to hear from the founders, farmers, innovators, and investigators that are shaping the future of the ag industry. Today's episode is a fascinating look into soil ecology, soil biology, from a place you might not expect to hear something so delightfully ag nerdy, McCain Foods. But before we dive into all of that, I want to take just a moment here to recognize our quarterly presenting sponsor, which this quarter is Case IH. Now, as most of you already know, I'm fascinated by the way technology and innovation are shaping the future of agriculture. That's why I do this podcast. But it's also why I'm excited to partner with Case IH this quarter. Case IH designs, engineers, and produces cutting-edge farm equipment based on a comprehensive understanding of farmers' needs, wants, and challenges, integrating these insights into their development and manufacturing. For example, take their model year 25 Magnum tractor. The new Magnum is purposefully designed to answer farmers' needs in every design and engineering choice. Improved horsepower for pulling heavier loads faster, bundled, integrated, and ready-to-go precision tech for greater accuracy in the field, and a transmission farmers can tweak for improved control and performance in different tasks. That kind of design thinking is exactly where the future of ag is headed, and that's why you'll be hearing me talk to folks at Case IH at different points throughout this quarter about what they do and how they're working to push ag forward. So thank you once again to Case IH for their leadership in ag innovation and for supporting the Future of Agriculture podcast. Okay, now back to today's featured conversation with Dr. Michelle Lynn D'Souza. Michelle is the manager of research and innovation at McCain's Farm of the Future project. In this role, her mission is to empower McCain on its journey to developing sustainable corporate frameworks that benefit society and nature through regenerative agriculture. We're going to dive into what all of that means here in the interview. Some of you might already know, though, that McCain has set some ambitious goals for transitioning their potato supply chain to regenerative practices. Over the years, they've been willing to lead in their commitments and also back up those commitments with incentives and support for farmers trying to adopt these practices. As such, they've hired scientists like Michelle. Michelle D'Souza is a molecular ecologist whose work focuses on biodiversity conservation, community engagement, and knowledge mobilization. So first and foremost, she's a scientist. And in addition to her work at McCain, she also still works as a visiting scientist at the Center for Biodiversity Genomics. Michelle and I have a great conversation today about McCain's commitments, how the progress has been so far, and how their farms of the future are designed to serve as farm-scale laboratories for regenerative transition. We also discuss why biodiversity should be a goal we should strive for in agriculture, who's responsible for footing the bill for regenerative agriculture and soil conservation, and a whole lot more. I'm going to drop into the conversation here where Michelle is describing how she originally got connected with McCain through her work there at the Center for Biodiversity Genomics when the company was trying to better understand soil biology.
they came to the Center for Biodiversity Genomics looking for experts in understanding soil biology. And, you know, that's a complex space to understand biodiversity, and largely because it's biodiversity that you cannot see. And so DNA technology and tools can really be one of the only ways you can ask that question. So I think in a lot of ways they came to the right people, and that's how they found me. And in August, it was August 2020, that I went to New Brunswick to the first Farms of the Future there to start that work.
Awesome. And I would definitely want to talk about the farms of the future. But first, as McCain was kind of making these sustainability commitments and transitioning to regenerative agriculture, what questions or concerns do you think prompted them to say, you know, we really need someone who understands biodiversity and genomics?
Yeah, there is a wealth of experts within McCain. I was absolutely blown away at the level of intellectuals that are understanding agriculture within that company. It's really amazing, coming from an academic background myself, to see how intimately people within McCain understand agriculture, soil, potatoes, and the challenges ahead. And so I think they approached this problem understanding that this is about ecology, ecology being the interactions of organisms. They understood that soil was at the heart of everything. They understood that there's this huge piece in soil that really hasn't been explored to the extent it needs to be, soil life. And I think that's really what prompted it to take the shape that it's taken today, and really informed where they're going with their sustainability efforts.
And this is a bit of a, I don't know, this might be somewhat philosophical. I'm not sure. Maybe not. But it seems to me that, you know, when we're farming, we are trying to get an outcome, get an output. And by nature of that, we are trying to bend, you know, ecology to our will. How do we know that, you know, these ecological principles still apply? And at what point are they trade-offs from what we're ultimately trying to do, which is produce, you know, food?
Yeah, we're part of this system. That's, I guess, the philosophical piece that you're referring to here. And a big part of why I don't think I ever really touched agriculture in a past life is because I saw it as this attempt at manipulation, which is what I think you're getting at. And it's not that, it's guidance, it's land stewardship, it's understanding. There's a responsibility we have as a very unique species. We are humans, right? We've been given this evolutionary responsibility, that's how I see it, to nurture and care for the things around us. And what better way to live that responsibility than farming? I don't know how I didn't see it before. And so for me, yeah, it's about output, and that's okay. That is what nature has been there for. That's what nature's been doing. It's been feeding itself. That's the source of life. So there's nothing wrong with that. I think it's how do we do that in a way that really uses the entire system more so than just a few pieces. And I think that's what we focused on a lot more than we could have really in understanding the whole picture. And I don't think that's because we didn't want to. It's challenging. And I think we're at this really amazing time right now where there's really incredible tools and technologies available to us to really live that responsibility.
And is it the fact that we have those tools now? Is that part of what prompted McCain Foods, which has been around a long time, to, want to make this transition now?
I think so. I really do. It is hard to know what we're up against when we can't see it, measure it, feel it, right? That's just reality. And, in my experience, I've seen the skyrocketing of appreciation for biodiversity with something as simple as a microscope. We get to see things now, you understand its shape, its size. So yeah, I think technology is redefining our relationship with nature. Another perfect example is the fact that we can read DNA now. So that takes this like microscopic, descriptive science into the world of information technology now. And I mean, I don't have to go into how fast that industry is developing. So it makes that connection and bridges that gap. And I think that's really what's propelling all of this work now. It's that intersection.
Yeah. Well, you referenced McCain's Farms of the Future earlier, and my mind was going a million directions, so I took us down a different rabbit hole. But let's talk about that. What exactly is this program?
Yeah. So I guess I'll take a little bit of a personal approach to it because that's how I first got involved in farming and how I got involved at McCain. It was when they invited me as a researcher onto the Farms of the Future. And that's, I think, a very important piece because that's what the Farms of the Future is. So in 2021, McCain made a bold commitment to partnering with growers to reimagine how we can grow potatoes. And this is coming through a very strong commitment in implementing regenerative agricultural practices across 100% of potato acres worldwide by the end of 2030. And so, in order to take this on, they have invested in Farms of the Future. So, three specifically. The first was initiated at Florenceville, New Brunswick, which is the birthplace of McCain. So, this is back in 2021. And it's really this playground where McCain gets to live what they are asking its growers to do, which is go on this transition and go on this journey to regenerative agriculture. And that's a big ask because there's a lot of risk and unknowns associated with that. And so the Farm of the Future is really about understanding that risk and inviting as many people as possible to engage in solving those very big challenges.
And this being something that McCain wanted to take a leadership role in, some might say, well, let the farmers worry about that. What do you see as McCain's role in wanting to get to this farm of the future?
I think it's McCain's responsibility in a lot of ways because it cannot be something a farmer does on their own. This is a systemic change that we're asking for. It's a systemic change that needs to happen, a change in the relationship we have with farming. And so that needs to take everybody involved to come on board. And, McCain's uniquely positioned, and I think one of the big players in this space because of the type of business that it is. So what I mean by that is they have such strong grower relationships. So from the inception of this company, it's always been about that intimate understanding and relationship with growers on the ground, about the agronomy first. And then they go from that potato and understanding that soil all the way down to that French fry in a package. So they have involvement across the supply chain. And I think that's what makes them really unique and very well positioned to tackle this problem. And I think they're doing that in a really lived way because they're inviting growers into the conversation, they're inviting researchers to the conversation, they're inviting government officials to the conversation, and we're all sitting down and trying to solve this.
And you said one of those farms is in Florenceville, New Brunswick. Were there others as well?
Yes, so they initiated the second farm in South Africa in 2023, and there is a third farm soon to be announced somewhere else in the world. And the idea is basically to capture as many climatic zones as possible to really live that regenerative practice and principles across various environmental factors.
And in 2021, when this was all kind of rolled out, if I remember right, it was kind of defined at that time how McCain viewed regenerative agriculture in terms of practices. Is that right? And this is, to tip my hand a little bit, this is getting me a little bit to the practices versus outcomes conversations when it comes to regenerative agriculture. So would love to hear kind of how you all are approaching that.
Yeah. So I think that's one of the biggest challenges we have right now. Regenerative agriculture is a concept that is hard to grapple with. It's not well defined. And we at McCain consider it an ecosystems-based approach with practices that provide support to really four key outcome areas or impact areas. So soil health, water, biodiversity, and climate. And so McCain developed a regenerative agricultural framework around some key principles that they knew that they wanted to impact, and then created indicators underneath those that were more tied to practices. So, it was a very thoughtful process with a lot of consultation around outcomes, practices, and connections, and really all of it working together with a very key point of how do we measure that as well.
And we're going on 4 years in here. How are things going as far as the transition to regenerative agriculture? What types of advancements have been exciting to watch, and where are you still seeing headwinds?
Yes, it has. It's been very positive, and it's great because yes, 4 years in now we're starting to see benefits in ways that we wouldn't before because this does take time. Our operators feel it when they're on the equipment. So you hear it from the operators. We have very tangible responses in our soil infiltration. So how our fields are becoming spongier and holding more water, which means I think it was about 2 years ago where we had some pretty adverse weather. We mitigated losses in storage when that wasn't the case amongst growers in the region because of the benefits we're seeing in our soil. So it's coming to bear now, and it's going to be a really exciting year because we've invited, as I said, these researchers onto our fields, and they've been measuring immense amounts of data around soil health, greenhouse gas emissions, compaction, biodiversity. And now we have this, full crop rotation cycle in, and we are getting to understand the benefits of all of the cover cropping, minimizing of tillage, livestock integration. So I think there's going to be some really impressive things that come to bear. And of course, all of it has to be tied around how much it costs and how difficult it is to implement. So yeah, this is going to be a very exciting year to do all of it. And to go back to that original question, the challenge is it's going to be the cost right now. It's going to be the cost of making all of this happen. And that's where McCain has to play a big role, and the industry really needs to support. It's transitioning this cost that is going to be a challenge.
And potatoes, I love potatoes. I live in Idaho. I'm a potato guy. However, potatoes would not be my first choice for a regenerative crop, given just the nature of what it requires to intensively grow potatoes. That seems daunting to me. How can regenerative agriculture fit into a potato growing system?
Yeah, 100%. And there's something to be said about tackling a problem and starting at the hardest piece because then everything else kind of gets informed by it. And I think that's the lens I like to look at. You start with the challenge. And how I see it being done well is in thinking about the entire rotation, right? You are going to disturb the soil. We know that disturbing soil has some detriment to soil life, carbon emissions, all of these things that we care about. So how do you do things in those other years to mitigate some of that damage? That's really, I think, how we need to tackle regenerative agriculture in potato systems.
And for you, you are looking at this at the most, microscopic scale, which I can only imagine how complex that is. If I'm somebody who's just a casual observer of agriculture, what types of things am I going to see on a regenerative potato farm that I might not see on one that is not, regenerative?
Yeah, the easiest thing that I think most people see when they come onto the farm of the future is you take a shovel and you try and stick it in the ground. That's the easiest way to evidence the benefits, how easily that shovel can go into our fields versus going into some of our control fields where we haven't done regenerative practices. It's night and day, right? How many earthworms you get to uncover after a really heavy rainfall, going in and seeing how the rocks kind of pop up on the fields where we haven't done regenerative practices because you're seeing erosion in real time versus not. It's these things, like you can see it happening in front of your eyes now, which is really great. And then of course having all of that data to also say actually, and it's by this much percentage. So that's really where I think people are seeing and believing. And that's what the farm of the future is about, right? Coming on to the farm and seeing the transition for yourself and understanding what are the ones that I can tangibly take away and implement one step at a time.
And when I think of regenerative agriculture, my mind goes to the soil health principles, right? So like reducing disturbance by reducing tillage, keeping a living root with things like cover crops, incorporating livestock. Are those the type of practices that are happening on the farms of the future? And if so, to what extent, and how much of a departure is this from how potatoes were grown a decade ago?
Yes, those are the principles. These are kind of, understood well within the community, right? And so these are the ones that form the basis of our regenerative agricultural framework, which is based on 7 specific indicators. But yes, 100%, they're based on those principles, and that's what we measure. How much of a departure that is from the way things were done in the past, that is a question I find hard to answer. I'm very new to potatoes. So I'll say this, when I kind of stepped onto this farm and I was understanding what regenerative agriculture is, especially from the space that I came in, I was like, wait, it is not common knowledge that planting different species is better for your soil. Like, that was very hard for me to really grasp. And I think it's an operational challenge. I think a lot of these things are operational challenges, right? In certain regions, you have smaller growing regions. It's markets of what you have around you. For example, really hard to integrate livestock in New Brunswick. We just don't have as much livestock around, right? There's just practical challenges. And that's where the hard work is in my mind. It's really, how do we make it make sense for the people in that community growing in the system that they've been growing in for some time? It can't be a dramatic overhaul overnight.
And what role does inputs play in soil health? And as you're looking at biodiversity and inputs, I mentioned fungicide earlier, and if you're looking at beneficial fungi, I'm sure there's an impact there. But what role does inputs have, and does that have a part in the Farms of the Future program?
Yeah, inputs have a huge role, right? Like, I think we don't capitalize on these evolutionary innovations that I've been speaking to. We basically give the plant an easy source of food, and so it doesn't rely on those microorganisms in the way that it has. And that's where the shift becomes important, right? Because have we destroyed that relationship? Like, is that where we are, where we've been feeding our plants so much that they don't know how to develop these relationships anymore? Like, where are we? Can we gain that back? And these are the questions I'm curious about. And I don't think we've destroyed these relationships by any means. I think they're there, just they're waiting to be harnessed. And it's about understanding how we can do that best. Inputs definitely have a role to play. I think, the steps we've been taking, the approach we've been taking at the Farm of the Future, for example, is like, how much less can we apply because we've enhanced soil health? And so we're cautious about how we do this. We can't go so far out of the realm of reality. So we always try to balance that approach and kind of, draw back a little bit at a time. And so that's really where we've been trying to push the bar. How do we harness soil health to decrease inputs? How do we understand better how much soil can mineralize nitrogen and provide it to the plant? And then how do we supplement that to get to the same levels of nitrogen we want and know we need? But how do we work with the soil better? That's really been our approach.
Sure, yeah. And if I'm a potato farmer, I make my money farming potatoes. I'm on board with like increasing my soil biodiversity, but I think in order to increase my soil biodiversity, I probably need to increase my above ground biodiversity, the plants that feed the soil. But I make my money on potatoes. So how do I avoid the trade-off of like less money but more diversity?
I think personally that is the role industry has to play here in helping that, right? A farmer is always going to be limited to what it can sell. That's the name of the game. So education's a huge piece here. As humans, we used to eat a lot more species of crops. That has dwindled, and that's having health implications, right? Like, this is a systemic shuffling we have to do. This is a conversation across the board of what we have to do. Yeah, how do we get farmers to grow more crops? We eat more different crops. We create markets for those different crops. We have to really reimagine how we tackle this problem.
And I understand one aspect of the Farms of the Future is this barcode soils project. I know you talked earlier about like reading DNA. I imagine those two ideas are connected, but can you explain what that is, the barcode soils project?
Yeah, so this is really going back to the work that brought me to McCain's. So understanding how we can use soil biodiversity to evidence regenerative benefits. So really understanding how to measure improvements in soil health while looking at that biology piece, which for a long time really hasn't been explored as much. And so we hit the ground running in 2020, actually well before we started cropping with potatoes in 2021, and did a baseline survey of all of the fields at the Farms of the Future. So there's about 23 different fields, about 500 acres in total with some forest land. And it was about understanding what's here, what are we starting with, and how is it going to change as we implement regenerative practices. So in that first year, we did a very thorough screen of all of these 23 fields. And then we went back to those exact same places in 2021 and in 2022. So now we have 3 years of data, which in my opinion is very spatially intense from what I see in soil science. So I'm very excited to even ask the basic question of how much does soil biodiversity change from here to a few meters ahead of you? How much does that change over time? How much does that change in the forest peripheries of that farm and where you've been farming it? So there's just like very fundamental questions we'll be able to answer, and then layering on that regenerative effect.
And so to measure soil biodiversity, my understanding is there's like, billions of microbes in like a tablespoon of soil or whatever people say about that. But are you literally counting? Are you literally counting these and seeing if there's more later? What does that look like in a non-scientist explanation?
Yes, you are. You're counting DNA molecules. That's what you're counting. So each DNA molecule can be associated with an organism. So you take 10 grams of soil. That's how much we process in a sample. So 10 grams of soil, you do some lab magic and extract DNA from that, and then you put it through these very high-tech sequencers, and you read every single letter of those DNA molecules. And that's what we're doing. And so it's not a exact quantitative measurement in that just because I have 100 molecules of this organism, that means there's 100 of those organisms, right? Like if an elephant walked through my field, like there'd be a lot more elephant DNA than any one single bacteria just because of size. But it gives you a relative idea, and that's really important, right? So it's the relative abundances that we're looking at, and we're looking across 3 large groups: bacteria, fungi, and animals. So when you look at those 3 groups together, you also can start teasing out potential interactions that exist because you're detecting them all in the same place together. So there are some assumptions we do make because at the end of the day, I'm detecting a DNA molecule. I don't know if that organism is actively functioning at that time or not, but it's a really easy starting point now. And I say easy because of where technology is. It's a little complex, but relatively easy to at least get an understanding of who's in the soil, who's moving above the soil and working around the soil, and how are they changing over time.
And is more necessarily better? Because if I'm a farmer, I'm hearing like bacteria and fungi. I'm like, I spray fungicide for some of those types of things. Like, do I necessarily want all of those, or do I want just a certain amount?
Yeah, and this goes back to, the origins of biodiversity. The planet has decided more is better, right? Because there's an idea of resilience that's built around diversity. When you have more players and each of them are doing different things, some of them are bad, some of them are good, in whichever way you want to define good and bad. But if you have too many bad players, your good players are going to be outcompeted. And that's really that shift, that imbalance that we're talking about when we talk about unhealthy soils. More isn't always better, 100%. It depends on who more is. But in general, the principle is the more functions you have, that's usually related with more diversity, the more you have the ability, if one good guy's knocked out, that another good guy is going to take its place. And everything kind of balances out in a better way.
I like talking in terms of good guys or bad guys. That's the level I can really understand the interactions here. But do we know enough about who the good guys are and what conditions, I should say, I was going to say practices, but I would say just conditions in general, promote a healthy balance of what we're calling kind of good guys and bad guys?
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. And that's That's the scary part, right? So there's going to be a bias, I'll say that. So let's go back to that question of how I know who is who, good or bad, by reading a molecule. The idea is you take all of these molecules, I don't know who they are, and I match them to a reference library. These reference libraries have been built in soil specifically, have been built by what we can culture in a little plate. I think the estimate is like, I don't know, something really, really low, less than 5% of what exists in soil can be cultured on a plate. So we're already so far behind on even how to build those reference libraries, let alone understand who these players are, right? So we really need to be creative to understand who's good and bad. We know a good idea of what exists out there because of the focus around pests, right? So a lot of what we know is around the bad guys. We don't understand as much about the good guys. And we need to think differently about how we do this, because like I said, this can't be done in the cultured petri dishes of the past. We have to be thinking to really creative ways to understand that function.
And, you know, two point of views you might hear out there. Number one would be, it sounds like yours, which is like, this is exciting. There's a lot we don't know. There's so much work to do. There's so much to discover. Another's like, we don't know anything yet. We shouldn't be doing any of this stuff, right? And I'm sure there's a spectrum in between, but can you share your point of view on why that's exciting and why that encourages you to want to work harder towards transitioning towards regenerative agriculture instead of saying like, well, hold on, we better figure out, we better know some of these unknowns first?
I get excited at the potential. That's where it is for me, right? So, when I think about the relationship between plants and soils, this is a relationship that's about 400 million years old. It was these prehistoric fungi that were the original roots for plants. They're what helped them become terrestrial. That's 400 million years of evolution and learning that we gain from. And that's what I think about. And I get energized by that because we're losing soil at such a rapid rate, which means we're losing biodiversity at such a rapid rate in a system that is one of the most diverse in our entire planet. So think of all of the solutions we are losing to some of these crises, right? When that mutualistic relationship evolved between fungi and plants, that changed the environment, right? That sucked out so much CO2 from the environment. It created life the way we know it today. This has happened in the past. One of the biggest challenges we have right now is climate change. It's all of that CO2 is back in the atmosphere again. Life has done this before. Like, I get excited by that. Yeah, we don't know how, but that's what I get excited about focusing on. How? Figuring those secrets out, talking to them now, and we have tools to do that. How exciting.
Can we bring it back in time, or do we need to, is it going to take the millions of years it took originally to get to this point? Or do you think, have you seen signs that we can return biodiversity to soils in a, I don't want to say reasonable time frame, because what's reasonable, but like in a quick time frame?
I think the biggest thing we can do right now is protect it. That is the biggest thing. We don't understand it. We need to archive it so that we can learn from it, right? That's the magic of DNA. It's a book. So put that book on a shelf, don't burn it, right? We need to work really hard to make sure that it is there to read. And that's what regenerative agriculture means to me. It's protecting and regenerating, allowing it to get bigger and better.
Well, how does your work at McCain influence your work at the university or vice versa? Are they interrelated on a daily basis?
They're magically intertwined, and it's really, I don't know, how do I say this? I was getting maybe a little frustrated that there's so much more opportunity for academics to engage with real life problems. And that's really what propelled me to step into this collaboration with McCain. It was just, I'd been thinking about these DNA tools, I've been looking at biodiversity conservation. Agriculture is this huge opportunity to make huge impact in the world, and it's not one that I was thinking about at all in terms of conservation. And so this for me is just scratching that itch of how do I take this academic knowledge, expertise, all of this work that is being done and really make impact on something very, very important like food. So when the opportunity arose to solve that challenge, it was, a no-brainer to me. So we talk a lot and we exchange ideas a lot. And that's the design, the model of the farm of the future, right? That researchers come in and we engage, because they're not going to have the perspective that industry has on the ground problems. But they gain that perspective by being on the farm and getting to meet a grower, getting to meet business execs who come and visit the farm, So this is really the model, I think, that's going to make a big difference.
And what's next? It sounds like so far you've been, trying these regenerative practices, collecting data, I'm sure analyzing that data. What's the next priority for this transition to regenerative agriculture? And the next question will be like, what comes after that?
Yeah. No, the priority right now is living those commitments. That's it. So putting in the work to get to 100% regenerative, putting in the work to decrease greenhouse gas emissions, all while not completely turning growers away. That's going to be the big challenge, and it's going to take us some time. So yeah, I think in the near future, in the next 5 years, that's where we're going. It's how do we live that vision, and then how do we sustain that vision? How do we make agriculture sustainable?
Well, Michelle, the show's called Future of Agriculture. So, if you were to think about what's possible here in looking out, a decade or two, paint a picture for us about what's possible with this work McCain's doing.
I think what's possible with this work, where I want to see it go, is where we can really help growers understand what they are protecting when they are farming. They are land stewards at the end of the day. They are holding a piece of evolutionary history that likely does not exist anywhere else on this world because of how fragmented and eroded our soils are. So I want to help growers understand what treasure they are keeping in their farms and how to better use that to support their business. That's where I want to see this go.
All right. Well, that is probably a great place to wrap up today's episode. Thank you so very much to Dr. Michelle Lynn D'Souza for being on the show today. Certainly enjoyed nerding out over soil biology and also hearing about McCain's commitment to regenerative agriculture and getting kind of a progress update there. If you'd like to learn more about them, we'll leave some links in the show notes for McCain's website, of course, as well as a podcast they have of their own called the Hot Potato Podcast you can check out. But thank you again to Michelle for being on the show and for making this episode happen. Thank you as well to our quarterly presenting sponsor this quarter, which is Case IH. Learn more about them at their website, which will also be in the show notes. And last but never least, thank you for your time and your attention. I do not take it lightly. I'll be back next week with another story of ag innovation.